Well, hello everybody and welcome. I'm Alex Kalianitis. I'm a postdoctoral scholar here at the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies, and it's truly an honor to be introducing Dr. Alicia Turner, who comes to us from York University in Toronto, where she's Associate Professor of Humanities and Religious Studies. Her talk tonight is called The Most Democratic Monastery, Religious Difference and Indifference in Colonial Burma. So I hope you'll all join me in welcoming Dr. Alicia Turner.
Thank you. That was way too generous of an introduction. It was really nice. I'm really honored to be here. You guys are wonderful to have me in, and I'm curious that this many people actually want to know something about colonial Burma and its odd Buddhist movements. And especially thank you to Irene and to Tatiana for putting all of this together. You guys have made it perfect to be here, and it's really nice. My earliest work is on issues of Buddhism and identity, that sort of the precursors to Buddhist nationalism in Burma. And I spent a decade really thinking through issues about how concern for the decline of Buddhism led to a movement of Buddhist identity and Buddhist movement in the early colonial period. And this was all, I sat reading the old newspapers and the old sources about a decade before any of these things really were contemporary issues that, say, a journalist would care about in Burma. But today they are very much that. The nationalist movement in Burma, and particularly the anti-Muslim violence that's going on, have made it very clear to me that these are not issues of history or of simply academic in a certain term interest, that they're actually very present in this way. And I preface what I want to say today in part by saying I'm interested, and I'm starting from a contemporary problem and a sort of larger body of theory in a way that's actually probably an odd thing to do for somebody who mostly focuses on, say, 19th century lay Buddhist movements or 19th century monastic conflicts over authority or these sorts of things. For the most part, you don't think about that being a contemporary and deeply theoretical issue. But I come to this from a realization that a critical assessment of such things in the past has all too important implications in the present, and that I think it's important for us as scholars to think about what the relationship is between those two at different moments. So to start with the theory bit, the chunk from the present, to think about the contemporary moment. So a year ago, the National League for Democracy won their elections in Burma. And against this euphoric victory of a democracy movement in Burma last fall, a lot of people are disillusioned about the government's refusal to denounce the anti-Muslim sentiment and practice what they consider a robust religious tolerance. Foreign observers are dismayed because they understood Buddhism to be quintessentially peaceful and tolerant, a view they developed through English language works on modern Buddhism, including those written by Aung San Suu Kyi herself. But those inside the country who have struggled for so long against the hatred that they saw intrinsic to the military government are shocked that the secular promised land of democracy has proven so barren of the peace and tolerance that they had imagined. So while many are accusing the new government of being insufficiently secular, I think the problem is not a lack of embrace of secularism, but the production of religious difference and division lies at the heart of both the modern state and the institutions of modern Buddhism. So, as Saba Mahmood has pointed us towards, the modern secular liberal state is not simply a neutral arbiter of religious differences. It actually produces and creates such differences. And to think through this problem, one has to begin by recognizing the contradictions and inequalities that political secularism generates and the religious presupposition it embeds in the legal and political life of the nation. That is to say, that the nation state itself is productive of religious difference, and that actually, in the larger theory, that is the idea of the secular that has created these bounded categories of religion as we know them in the modern world. So while contemporary political analysts in Burma are busily labeling certain monastic groups as more or less tolerant and various political factions are more or less committed to secular vision, they miss the real depth of this issue. The lack of pluralism isn't simply about a lack of ethics or will. The construction of religious difference that enables both religious nationalism and ultimately violence is a constitutive element of both the modern state and modern Buddhism, and one that both have a stake in maintaining. It is the paradoxical thread at the heart of these institutions and of secularism themselves. So in contemporary Burma studies, a lot has been made about divisions like national registration cards that single out Indians and Chinese such that they don't have full citizenship rights and aren't able to participate in public life. But the sort of national registration that happens in the contemporary moment, with divisions of race and religion clearly labeled, aren't some sort of insufficient secularism of the last military regime. They're instead direct inheritance from a colonial secular state whose ways of knowing required that its population be clearly bounded by categories of race and religion. This epistemology of knowing someone by race and religion is necessary not because the state was particularly biased or insufficiently secular, but because the state in Burma since 1852 has based its claim to sovereignty on its ability to practice religious tolerance. Religious and racial identity and religious differentiation make the individual legible to the state in a way that justifies the modern state's existence. But in this, the state hasn't been alone in doing these projects within Burma, at least since the turn of the last century. Multiple institutions of modern Buddhism have been active in constructing Buddhism to respond to secular expectations of religion and promoting discourses of Buddhist identity and community as bounded and distinct. This includes not even or just primarily those movements that are labeled as nationalist movements, but the breadth from Vipassana meditation to Waksa occult practices to even sets of monks who are engaged in interreligious dialogue. They, of course, have an interest in a bounded category of religion. But in contrast to the institutional production and enforcement of religious difference, pockets of pluralist interaction have been a key undercurrent in Burmese Buddhist life for the past century and a half, I would argue. Paradoxically, even as the state and modernist Buddhist institutions require greater difference, there have been persistent interventions that have interpreted Buddhism as a mechanism for movement, connection, and interaction that defy the boundaries of religious difference. These various initiatives, when they rise to the level of elite notice, tend to be labeled as heterodox, plebeian, anti-modern for the ways in which they defy conventional boundaries. But they're interesting nonetheless, and they're persistent throughout Burmese Buddhist history in this way. So the larger project I'm working on now charts a genealogy of two corollary approaches to religious tolerance. First, the practices of the modern state and modern Buddhist institutions that construct and enforce boundaries of religion and religious difference on one hand, and then these various unconventional Buddhist interventions that defy boundaries of religious difference and engage in modes of pluralism and plebeian cosmopolitanism. So today what I want to do for you is look at two concrete instances in which we have this religious difference operating and the Buddhist practices that deconstruct such differences in the late 19th century. The first one is a place called Thieta Monastic Complex in Rangoon, what one observer called the most democratic of monasteries. It's the product of the physical creation of ethnic and religious boundaries at the foundation of the colonial city. But in this, it actually defiantly disregards religious boundaries and ethnicity to welcome anyone who wants to come. And the second example I want to talk you through is a monastic reform sect. And here we get closer to what a good Buddhologist really looks at, is monastic reform. But this reform sect takes place in colonial Tavoy or Dawei, which is a small port city a long way from both the royal capital and the colonial capital. And it participates in this growing modernist logic in which defines Buddhism more and more in exclusivist terms, but it uses its participation in that to create a space for a new Buddhism that allows much more pluralistic interaction of local religious and ethnic minorities. What I'm trying to do today is simply just open up a space for consideration of the constructs of religion, secularism, and religious difference within a Burmese Buddhist context, and to bring that body of theory into greater conversation with the study of Buddhism. To do this, the Thieta monastic complex I want to start with is really, it's a maze. It's a warren. The paths in there wander in and out and back and forth across each other. And it's really a place of confusing paths, which is a fact that's going to play an important role in the story I'm going to tell you today. But I think it's a really good place to start for thinking about these things, because it's a good place for disrupting clarity and order. It plays this role in the history of the city historically, but also maybe conceptually. It's good for disrupting ideas, categories, things, as it does for me as I wander its paths. So what I want to do is take you on a walk through the entangled and contrasting conceptual grammars that happen in colonial Burma, and specifically looking mainly at Rangoon in the late 19th and 20th centuries. So here's a bit of colonial bit left from Theat Daw here. I need to tell you a little bit about the construction of Rangoon here. Before the arrival of the British, Rangoon was simply a small fort town. It was governed by a representative of the Burmese king. But in the War of 1852, in which the British take over all of Lower Burma, the town has massive destruction, and most of the Burmese habitation is destroyed in there, including monasteries and pagodas. Immediately after the war, the British set to construct their new capital, on the site of the former port. This capital was meant to represent a modern colonial order that they meant to impose. So with the exception of the Sule Pagoda, right there in the center, which becomes the center of their grid, and the Shwedagon Pagoda, which is much further north, which is the iconic pilgrimage site said to house 8 hairs of the Buddha, the British basically remove all traces of Burmese habitation and culture from the grid that they create. They replace this with a highly regimented network of streets and buildings that mean to act out a physical pedagogy of the proper order and discipline in colonial society. The streets are all at right angles, with thoroughfares leading from the river and divided by long east-west streets. And the place is to be clean and clear order, with colonial hierarchies made very plain. Right? The north and south streets are all set in alternating sizes, with wider streets at the center and then larger and smaller streets. In between this, the hierarchy of the institutions and the people between them is meant to be represented in the geography itself. And the kind of buildings that are allowed to be built. Any building that would have been built of a porous building material that would have allowed for the free flow of air and light, but also people and ideas and sounds to go through as band. You have to build things in brick and cement with pucca roofs, meaning, first of all, that only the richest could afford to build these things, but also clearly making an idea of what a modern sensibility is, that we need to be bounded in this way. So they sold off the land, and it was fairly easy if you had the money to get a piece of it, but they had very specific restrictions about how you could buy. They only gave away a few pieces of land without any cost. They made these free grants of land early on. The grants they make are an American Baptist church, an Armenian church, a Hindu temple, a Mughal mosque, a Sorti mosque, 1 synagogue, a Tenji, and then 2 Chinese temples, a Hokkien and a Fokien Chinese temple, and finally a Catholic convent in the first statement around 1852, and then a couple of decades later they give space for a Presbyterian church and a Kali temple and a Sikh temple. They're laying out a very clear pedagogy of where religion is to exist within this, and they're giving you very bounded spaces where it should be. So recently there have been more studies about thinking about the construction of urban Rangoon and the ways in which it created very clear ideas of race and culture in Burma. So we have Jade Roberts has done an interesting study in the Chinese community. Anthony Wade has recently argued that the specific exclusion of Buddhist institutions from the grid actually sets up the origins for an exclusive Burmese Buddhist nationalism. But I want to look at this in a different way today. I want to work from Talal Assad's argument that it is the creation of a universal secular epistemology that constructs the idea of religion as bounded and limited. Assad charts the genealogy of this concept, pointing out that it's the idea of a shared, universal, disenchanted space is actually a very specific European intervention, and it's an invention of a certain time and place in Europe. So this is what he says, right? Now what we retrospectively call the social, that all-inclusive secular space that we distinguish conceptually from variables like religion, state, national economy, and so forth, and on which the latter can be constructed, reformed, and plotted, didn't exist prior to the 19th century. And yet it's precisely the emergence of society as an organizable secular space that made it possible for the state to oversee and facilitate an original task by redefining what would be religion, by redefining religion's competence. This is to say that the work of secularism and the construction of religion begins by offering this new way of seeing the world that defines common and shared spaces as secular and disenchanted, thus while constructing and confining religion to only particular parts of social life. And I think that's pretty clearly seen in the ways in which land is given out for this construction of the grid. If the new inhabitants of the colonial city are to be ordered in clear hierarchies, things are to be clear and in no way chaotic, here again, religion could be located, specifically located on the map, and literally constructed in bounded places, right? The lots and land grants meant that any messy worldviews, rituals, discourses that people brought with them to this new colonial city would not be allowed to spill out willy-nilly into public interaction. It had to be contained into a conceptual space of this category called religion and literally contained within the map. And while there was little that could be done about the Buddhist sites that were there, the rest were actually clearly sort of held into a pretty rigid space. The grid also has the other clear argument of colonial discipline, that religions and ethnic differences would be fundamental and unbreachable aspects of identity and thus position. Therefore, not only are we have specific religious institutions here, but there's specific areas of the grid laid out for Indians, for Chinese, for Europeans to live in. So we have ethnic enclaves within this. And there are no places within the grid laid out for Burmese at all, or any national indigenous minorities. Now, the exclusion of the Burmese from here is where the story starts to get really interesting. This is where we're going to leave the colonial grid and this perhaps too familiar story of colonial secular governments, governmentality. When the British wipe out all of the Burmese inhabitants from this grid space, they're forced to relocate all of the former Buddhist monasteries. Prior to this, in the 1830s, there had been a monastery set up in what had been a sort of quiet space outside of town, a nice little mango grove set up by the previous king. And even when the British set up their colonial grid, this space is still just on the edge of town. And so the monastery that was set up, Thiepdaw, meaning just the Mango Grove Monastery, actually comes to be the place where all of the monasteries that they wiped out of the grid get relocated to this place. And so eventually the jumble of any monastery that had been elsewhere in this space comes to be held together in now what's a Jaundite, a monastic complex, so a complex that holds multiple monasteries. In 1854, the British Queen made it official and granted the land on this site as specifically religious land. And by the late 19th century, this Thiepdaw monastic complex comes to house really dozens of different Buddhist monasteries, each with a different identity and different approach. Now, if the grid you have around it is very clean and ordered, and the buildings are all these sort of cement pucca buildings, things are completely the opposite inside Thiepdaw Jaundite. It's a warren. Its monastic buildings are jumbled on top of each other, separated by skinny, winding, disjointed paths, and it's really easy to get lost inside here, something I actually really enjoy doing. It's fun to wander about. There have leafy, shady spaces between the buildings are in stark contrast to the clear, open, and ordered space of the surrounding streets. Colonial observers tend to describe Thiepdaw in terms of chaos and disorder. So here's a 1905 description. Its grounds were surrounded by a crumbling wall and a shallow, weed-choked ditch that could not be styled a moat for a lack of water. 3 badly warped planks nailed together to form a drawbridge that wouldn't draw led through a breach in the western wall, the main entrance, evidently for many a year. Inside is a teeming village of light 2-storied buildings with deep verandas above and below, scattered pell-mell around the enclosure as if they'd been constructed in some gigantic carpenter shop, shipped off to their destination, and then left wherever the expressmen just dropped them off. The irregular plots and courts between them are trodden bare or hard with ankle-deep sand. Here or there's a tree, but nobody trims them, and within the area there's neither grass nor flower nor garden patch. Right? This is clearly describing a chaotic and open and fluid place, not the place of order that it is. It's a place out of place in the colonial secular modernity as others would know it. The Thiepdaw complex earns a reputation over the next 150 years as a place that both resists the imposition of order, whether it be by colonial officials, doctors, modernist Buddhist reformers, or military governments. It hosts a number of politically dissident movements over the years, but it's also clearly a place where different groups of people could freely mix and interact. And in this way, it's earned this name of the most democratic of monasteries. If you start to look through the names of the monasteries that have survived from the colonial period in there, or when I can figure out what the original colonial names were, it actually reads like a gazetteer of all the small towns in Lower Burma. It's pretty clear that each of these monasteries represent a smaller community that had come to what was going to become the colonial center. And it represents more than this. What I've come to know about the place is that many of these monasteries were really in the business of housing both monks, but often lay people who had come from these smaller towns to come into the colonial center. And when I tell contemporary people that I want to work on Thiep Da, they often tell me, actually one particular important Buddhist guy said, "Why do you want to work on that place? There's so many good monasteries in Rangoon. This place has mixing between lay people and monks, men and women. Like, none of this is okay." It's clear that this is a place that basically colors outside the sort of modernist, secularist, Buddhist lines. And it involves too much mixing for many of our modernist elites. And it clearly became a place that welcomed anybody. In fact, the hospitality was not just for Burmese or for Buddhists in any regard. It had people from all of these smaller places, but also the description I just read you of Thiep Da comes from an American beachcomber, a hobo, somebody who's backpacking, who was told that he could find a free place to stay within the monastery, a recommendation that came to him from this Irish Buddhist monk that I work on. And he even goes on to describe how there's poor sailors of both European and African descent who just happen to wander in and find a place to sleep there. So as you begin to see, by the 1960s, we have reports that there's probably about 2,000 different lay families living within the monastic complex. And this is probably still true today. My faux attempt at anthropology of religion is to wander through and count up the laundry and see who I think is actually living in the place at this point. It's clear that it's a multi-ethnic, but also has plenty of lay people within it, as well as monks from lots of different places. So, to give you another view of where it lies within the grid here. So what we have is a picture of a Buddhism within this place that's both highly social and eschews an austere or morally restrained approach. It represents a place of ethnic interaction. It's located on the edge of the colonial grid, and it's located on Godwin Road, which means nothing to anybody in the post-colonial period. But the name in the post-colonial period is Lemada, which to anybody who knows Rangoon means Chinatown. It's located right on the edge of the most multi-ethnic but also bustling commercial center, and right at the end of the road that led from the jetty, in which was the most common for the smaller boats, not for the larger European trade, but for anybody who would have come from around the region to come in. And this is why we get a lot of these sailors in there. But the kind of mixing and interaction and sort of festivals that are happening there is not always appreciated by the Burmese Buddhist elite. In the descriptions that we have a middle-class Sino-Burmese who comes and visits Thiep Da, and he describes festivals that are going on, theatrical performances that are happening, and he completely doesn't approve of any of this. But he's come for specifically, actually, the festival that's happening this week, the Festival of Lights, in the 1880s. And the description he gives us is this. We wandered our way into the sacred exclosure by a little bridge on the eastern side, and after much pushing and charging in our efforts to thread our way through the crowd, we at least reached the Jaun where one of our friends was waiting for us. The sacred building was much overcrowded, and the remark of the Burman, "Lu mishihe, kala ne tinfe shire." Hey, there's no men here, i.e. Burmans. It's just kala and Chinamen, was perfectly justified. We soon learned that the stream of people coming to this Jaun was owing to a theatrical performance that was going on in the nearby sacrificial tables. Our exclaiming Burman here is complaining there aren't enough of the right kind of people here. Our Burmese Buddhist elites don't like the people that have come in here. And the problem is the place is instead, in his opinion, filled with Indians and Chinese. But of course, these are exactly the neighbors of the Thiep Da monastic complex. It's an urban monastery, and it's set in a multicultural and multi-ethnic place. The terms he uses, kala is a very derogatory term, even in the colonial period, that often refers mainly to Muslims, but anyone of Indian descent. Teo is slightly more neutral in meaning, but clearly means Chinese. But it's meant to signal out the fact that for this Burmese Buddhist elite, there was a certain kind of religious and ethnic identity that was supposed to belong to the correct practice of Buddhism, and Theato was not following those rules. It was not accepting this. Right? Ethnicity and bounded ideas of religion seem not to be necessary qualifications for who could count as one of those people who could participate in Buddhism in Theato. Buddhism here is constructed as a project that brings people together freely, offers shelter openly, and is less concerned with the boundaries of identity than with interaction and a mobile cosmopolitan ethos. And so we get this conflict between these two images of Buddhism that are happening within this place. Theato constructs Buddhism in this urban colonial space as open, available place for interaction. Theato's Buddhism was a universally applicable set of ideas and opportunities that invite participants to interact. So while much of the Colonial Archive's discussion of this place are focused on what seems to be the problematic fluidity of its boundaries, constant anxieties about whether boundary markers are being respected, whether it's too dirty, too porous, too multicultural, too interactive. However, Theato clearly has its own conceptual grammars and binaries that make it work. We have respect of ideas of Lokia and Lokotra, of lay and monastic divisions between scholasticism and ritual celebration, all of which we know are going on there. It's clear, however, that such divisions and the rules that Buddhism within the monastery apply to are very distinct from and resistance to the divisions that the colonial state secularism, right? Those divisions of religion and secular, public and private, and clear-cut and unbreachable divisions of race and religious identity. Theato doesn't respect the colonial secular grammars. The place was filled with Indians and Chinese, and poor white sailors, and Burmese ethnicities from all of their native places. But the contrast I'm trying to lay out for you between this colonial grid and the maze inside Theato isn't a contrast between a secular West and indigenous Burmese Buddhism, or a contrast between colonizer and colonized. Theato doesn't represent some surviving pre-colonial, multicultural religious institution and worldview that's set against the Western secular. Theato is the product of the colonial urban pedagogy of the secular. It's the grid that creates Theato. And just as Mahmoud and Assad draw our attention to the ways in which a secular epistemology that constructs religion as a bounded category, right, that is the secular that produces religion, it is exactly the colonial grid that produces Theato. Its monasteries and its monks from many different places were jumbled together only because of the production of a modern regulated secular city required moving religion together and putting them in this place. It in this way is an entangled accident of the British secular experiment in Rangoon. It has its own ways of expressing its ideas of Buddhism, but those are clearly in opposition to the secular categories there. Right? And the answers it constructs drew on past Buddhist concepts and categories, but also on colonial categories as well, to answer a new set of problems that are posed by the contingent colonial situation in urban life. How to accommodate the people, the ideas, and the cultures from their many different places. But the answer it offers is just as contingent as colonial a product as the secular disciplinary grid that it opposes. So I want to lay these two out against each other for you to sort of think about how we complicate these sets of issues. And I think it's a really nice space for complicating that. I want to give you a second example to show you the kind of things I'm interested in pulling apart here. And take you away from Rangoon, down to a tiny colonial port city of Tavoy. Also, the Burmese contemporary pronunciation would be Dawei. And just to give you a little geography, Rangoon there is up at the sort of mouth of the peak, and the river goes in there. The Burmese heartland, actually I have this thing, here we go. So Rangoon is here. The royal capital of Mandalay from the 1850s is here, but basically all of the royal heartland, the central Burmese heartland, would be right around here. So Amarapura, an earlier capital, Ava, an even earlier capital. Basically, this is where the royal centers would be. Tavoy is all the way down here. It's a colonial port. Well, it's a port city long before it's a colonial port city. And the Burmese have conquered this space And people in Tavoy claim a Burmese heritage. They would claim to be Burmese ethnically, although there's plenty of other ethnic minorities in the area. And as you can see, you have to go over the hills, but there's easy connections with Bangkok. And then as a colonial city, you'd have connections down to Penang, Malaysia, and up to Rangoon as well. So it's a place where people flow in and out of quite a bit. I first wandered into Thieta because I was interested in a specific monastery within the complex that was the Tavoy Monastery there. And I was interested in that because my iconoclastic, weird Irish Buddhist monk got me there. And he's great for getting me into really weird spots. He's been really fun for that. But also, he led me to see a set of connections to a cosmopolitan and multi-ethnic interactions that seem to follow Tavoy people to their enclaves wherever they go. So groups of Tavoy people living in Bangkok and Rangoon and Penang seem to end up in these really interesting multi-ethnic sets of interactions. But once I got to Tavoy, I did what good Buddhist studies scholars should do. I looked at monastic history. And I discovered that there was a new monastic reform sect created in the 19th century in Tavoy. And the sort of history of the study of modern Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia is often, particularly the 19th and early 20th centuries, about the creation of these modern Buddhist reform sects. And this is a sort of very standard history, right? A small group of monks discover that everybody around them is practicing Buddhism really, really poorly. And they are either more scholastic or more ascetic than everyone else. Sooner or later, they gather a following and they either gather support from the royal center and become the official Orthodox lineage, or they become the sort of separate and more seen as more ascetic lineage. And this happens across Thailand, Cambodia, Burma, and it's a fairly standard narrative, right? We have these split off sects, and eventually they become this sort of new orthodoxy, and they become, within these splits of sects, a way of creating a more enforceable or top-down hierarchy within that, enforcing a sort of uniformity across monastic discipline. This is a really standard history. In fact, it's really one of the only things written about monastic history in Southeast Asia, problematically. So when I started reading about the history of a new 19th century monasticism in Tavoy, and I read that they had their own new, particularly ascetic, particularly scholastic sect, I thought, yippee. I know how this one turns out. This is not going to be that interesting. But it got more interesting as I went on. So let me give you a couple of highlights from this. Ashin Indrawinta, known earlier as a child as Shui Sin, Golden Elephant, was born in Tavoy in 1831. He studied under a monk there called Thara Dinza Musa, and at the age of 7, he begins his studies. At the age of 9, his teacher takes him to the Burmese royal capital of Amarapura, right? Actually, I'll give you here. So he goes from all the way down here, all the way up to the monastic to the royal capital at the top, where he resides in the Thathanabain's monastic complex. Now, the figure of Thathanabain is going to become important within this, but to said lightly, he was the royally appointed head of the Thudhamma monastic lineage, and he was basically responsible for the promotion of the sasana on behalf of the king. He was the king's right-hand man for the promotion of Buddhism in the realm. So, our boy from the hinterlands is taken even into the monastery here. At the age of 12, he turns out to be a child prodigy. He's able to recite the Tripitaka before the learned monks and the king. King Theawadi gives him the title of Tripitaka Patama Jaw, and the queen adopts him as her son. When he becomes a monk at the age of 20 or fully ordained, he's given the name of Indrawinta by the Thathanabain himself. And a Princess Sakya Devi, who's actually going to go on to be the consort of the most famous mid-century king, King Mindan, personally attends his ordination and becomes his patron. So, local boy from the furthest points of the kingdom goes to the center, and the place where he's from, Tavoy in the south, has now by this point come under British rule, but the royal center is separate is still independent. Our boy turns out to be a textual prodigy, receives recognition not just from the head of the order, but from the royal family. 1857, which is after the British have conquered the lower half of Burma, including Rangoon, but before they have conquered the areas to the north, he returns to Tavoy with his preceptor. And in local memory and iconography, their return is seen as being welcomed with open arms and accompanied by a donation of the full set of Tripitaka texts on the back of an elephant. and the image isn't very good, but this is what our princess has given him, is an elephant filled with Tripitaka texts. And this is one of about 20 manuscript cabinets in the monastery where he's eventually established. I don't think these date to 1857, but they're still nice. There's still some pretty nice manuscripts there. And this is as folks are wont to do, make a sculpture of what folks they think he looks like. They're pretty sketchy pictures. Sorry about that. It's clear images here, right? He's bringing texts and orthodox monastic tradition from the north, from the center, to the hinterlands. And the dates also give you a clear politics of what's going on within this, right? He's born just after the first annexation, and just after that gets sent from the place that's been annexed by the British to the royal capital that's independent. He comes back in a moment of crisis for the royal capital in which they've lost half of the country, and he's being sent as the emissary of correct Buddhism from the center back to the hinterlands. Upon his return, he and his preceptor found a new monastery. And as the Burmese history recounts, quote, as the two monks avoided affiliation with other monks and only focused on scriptural studies and practicing meditation, other monks loathed their manners and tried to interrupt them. He wasn't really popular when he got home. At one point, a British official came and investigated them at the request of the letters sent by these monks. The official found him innocent and let him continue his work. Then, in 1866, the two monks moved to another village just outside of Tavoy, and again the local monks send a letter, this time to the Thathanabaing, complaining that Indra Wintha is trying to create divisions within the Sangha, and ask the Thathanabaing to come and tame him. And like the British colonial official, the Thathanabaing finds him innocent. Now try and figure out what's going on within this. The conflict between the local monks in Tavoy and Indra Wintha and this new, what will be a new monastic set he sets up. I have to give you a little bit of history of understanding the structure of monasticism in the 18th and 19th centuries Burma. So the standard description you would be given is that with the creation of a royally sanctioned monastic lineage at the turn of the 19th century, we have a Thathanabaing who's taken to be the head of the Sangha, and he has the ability to arbitrate dispute and to control basically a larger hierarchy of who is allowed to regulate. And the image that's given out is as if this centrally organized lineage and this position in his Thudhamma council have sort of absolute control all the way down to the village and monastic level. But actually, this image, which works really, really well when the British want to appoint the Thathanabaing as the head of all of the Sangha in the colonial period, it works very well for them, right? And thus it's promoted by the British, and it's promoted, of course, by the people who got appointed to the top of that position. But the reality is that it's basically a convenient fiction, a massive oversimplification of what's actually operating structures of monastic authority in the 18th and 19th century. As Alexei Kirichenko has demonstrated, the position of Thathanabaing as an absolute head of the Sangha was a colonial creation and really only had a tenuous relationship to the previous position under the royalty. And in fact, Kirichenko lays out 5 different types of monastic authority structures that are operative in any given monastery for the period. And I'm going to give you 4, spare you a little bit of it, and give you just a sketch of what he means by these. In part because all 4 of them are important for figuring out what's happening in this conflict. So first we have the Thathanabaing, who under the royal situation was really only responsible for projects of promoting the Sasana and the royal projects of promoting the Sasana. So that meant royal works programs, creating monasteries, purifying royal editions of the texts, and at times arbitrating disputes between different groups of monks. But in practice, the authority and intervention of the Thathanabaing or the Thudhamma Council at the level of individual monasteries was actually fairly limited. He was mainly about a royal project of royal merit-making and Sasana preservation. The second authority structure we have are Gains, which are local ritual communities who are only about enforcing monastic discipline in those local spaces. These are the groups that are defined by common performance of the ecclesiastical ceremonies, and they're linked to a specific area. So a locality might have a couple of different ones of these, and people could move between different Gains. So monks could move from monastery to monastery, and they'd be under the authority of different Gains. The third is the sort of reformist sect set up by charismatic monks, and the final is a thing called Gana Wiimote. Kirichenko calls this local and translocal structures that are granted autonomy from other hierarchies and ritual communities. He says groups seeking to ritually differentiate themselves from earlier hierarchies and ritual communities in the areas, usually when they weren't satisfied with the latter standards of orthopraxy, could be exempted from the jurisdictions of local hierarchies. This type of immunity was called a group exemption, Gana Vimutti, right, which in the Burmese pronunciation then becomes Gana Wiimote. And we know that this is happening with royal sanction from the 1840s on. When, in this way to establish a new ritual community is recognized by a formal investiture document that's made by establishing structures that are less vulnerable to splitting the Sangha. So if you get one of these, then you're not able to be accused of this. What we get is going on with Indrawunta is he's playing off the local Gain structure is concerned that they've rejected him for one reason or another. Either he's become a bit of a ritual snob, bringing his ideas from the center down, or they don't like the royal attention that he's gotten. But he refuses to participate within their ritual structures. But of course, making an accusation that someone is causing a split in the Sangha is one of the most serious accusations you could make. So he needs to be exempted from that. And the interesting interplay with authority here is really useful. At first, the local Gain draws not on any Buddhist authority, but appeals to a colonial official to arbitrate this. And then they go to the Thathanabaing himself. There's a conflict going on. Eventually, by the 1890s, the colonial government is going to choose to recognize a head of the monastic structure, a Thathanabaing, and put him in as this absolute ruler. The problem is that the person that most of the monks think can belong in that spot is not the person that the British put in the spot, and the person that most of the monks think belong in that spot, he gets in trouble with the British enough. He doesn't make them happy. So the British decide that they would rather just leave the job open when the first monk dies, instead of have Pakan Sayadaw take over. But by the 1890s, the issue has come to a head for Indrawunta, and he appeals to this new unofficial Thathanabaing, and we get a royal order sent down. Right? 2 royal orders are granted from the Sangharaja, this unofficial, not recognized by the British government, Pakan Sayadaw Thathanabaing in 1896. And it reads, Indrawunta won't be summoned to any Gain O, Gain Chow, or Gain Hao. Second, Indrawunta has been put in the position of Gana Wiimote. He gets his own monastic faction within this. Basically, he's been looking to exempt himself from the requirements of the ritual community and to keep him from being pulled away into ritual participation, right? Basically, he's saying in the most polite monastic fashion he can, buzz off. And by 1896, he gets the right to say, back off. But he's negotiated this in a really careful attention to both the centralizing practices of the Thathanabaing structure and the royally sanctioned center. He has the authority of this, right? He was pulled into the Thathanabaing's monastery even as a child. So he's using part of that authority and their project of making Buddhism more organized, more disciplined, but also more top-down oriented, sort of creating a more bounded idea of Buddhism as a monastic structure and as a religion in responses to the pressures of a colonial government. But also he's playing this off the local Gains in the local community. And what he does brilliantly is to get himself a spot outside of both of them. Now, I don't have enough space to give you the next chunk of the history in which the person who takes over from him actually goes to the centers and comes back again and founds this new place called the Zayawadi Monastery, which is particularly colonial both in its architecture, but also in its multiculturalism. Because what we come to find out about this monastic faction is that its major sponsors by the turn of the 20th century are Chinese donors. And actually Chinese donors who probably wouldn't be identified as Theravada at all. And it's very clear that the ways in which Buddhism becomes practiced here, part of getting separation from the center is also getting separation to be able to engage the sort of more multi-ethnic population that exists on the margins. So the interactions that begin to happen and this new monastic lineage by participating in the project of centralization and sort of consolidating Buddhism in one hand. We also he's able to play himself off and get enough space for different kind of Buddhism that he wants to promote. Indra Wunta and then later Dila Thera, who promotes this. So this is actually the face of the donor and the most important monastic sponsor, which in colonial Tavoy context, this is very clearly an overseas Chinese face and a major businessman who's come through. So it's clear that he's producing an idea of separateness in order to get the right to engage a much broader multi-religious and multi-ethnic interaction that would not have been possible in the royal centers, right? There's a work towards an exclusivity of a Burmese Buddhism in ethnic and nationalist terms eventually. So I've taken you through these two weird and wonderful places of these sort of particular colonial entanglements with religion. And in each case, these are only produced by the problems of the colonial context, right? They're not simply indigenous things that have come out, but they're produced out of this dialogue between the colonial sets of interactions. Both examples are meant to lay out how the contingency of the colonial plan of efforts at governmentality, governments, and state secularism in turn produced new colonial Buddhist projects, plebeian cosmopolitan mixing of the Etta monastic complex, and a separate, a distinct place for Tavoy Ganui Moat that protected a space for a local definition of who could be important as a Buddhist. And far from offering answers to the problems of the past or the present, I really hope that I've only raised more complications, pointing out the contingent nature of those structures that claim to be natural or universal status, but also gesturing our attention towards how, when faced with the changing social and political landscapes in the past, Burmese Buddhism offered pragmatic modes of inclusion, connection, and interaction across sets of boundaries. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think you'll take some questions, and I'm sure there are many.
I feel like I pulled a lot of things together fast, so if things don't make sense, I definitely understand.
I think maybe if it's all right, I'll start. I just was wondering, in terms of the monastic complex itself on the edge of colonial Rangoon, what sense do you have of the kinds of economic activities that are actually happening within this sort of maze-like complex?
That are going on in there? So in 1911, there's a court case that goes on, which is a land dispute between two different monasteries inside. And the outcome of the court case, the colonial courts don't really want to deal with this place. The outcome of the court case is they create a set of rules for what the monasteries inside can do. And the monasteries then are supposed to have clear fences around their monasteries, and they're not allowed to put ladders over the fences or let things grow. They're not allowed to bring in people who might be sick and give them traditional medicines. They're not allowed to, and I like to read these. It's a set of colonial rules, and it's sort of published in a very colonial fashion, but I read it a lot like Vinaya, which is, if there's a rule, it's because it was broken once, right? And actually the rules tell you a lot more about probably what practices were going on that thought they needed to outlaw than they tell you about practice afterwards. In fact, they probably tell you a lot more about things that continue to happen. So a lot of these rules, so healing but the Rangoon Hospital is right across the street. But it's clear that there were lots of healing practices that were going on with people coming through. It's also clear that there's lots of sailors and there's lots of people who are coming to trade their goods, and who live and stay there before they get back on the boats and go back to wherever they're from, or may live there for longer periods of time. So there's hostels that eventually sort of, non-religious hostels that evolve in the neighborhoods or outside of there. And it's pretty clear that's an elaboration of the fact that people had been living inside there as far as commerce. So, but it'd be petty trade, rice traders, petty commodity trade, barter trade, as far as I know. Yeah.
Thank you. Can we open it up and some questions?
I still don't understand who called the monastery democratic. What is
Why does it mean democratic?
What is democratic?
It's a contemporary friend, he's a figure in Rangoon at this point. But he was trying to explain what's the history of this place. So it was known in 1988, which is the students' movement, the beginning of the democracy movement. The boundaries of this monastic complex were a place that the military couldn't come in. And in fact, there were monks who held court within it to arbitrate. If people were thought to be spies for the military intelligence, they were actually captured and brought in and tried within it. It was an important place in the 2007 Saffron Revolution. But also, he's making reference to things like it was also the place where the first motion picture was shown inside the country. It was a place for all these theatrical performances. It's not that Theater has a completely pluralist past at all times. It's also monks from there were involved in one of the anti-Indian riots, which was really an anti-prison riot. There was a conflict with the prison guards, and the prison is again just across the street from the monastic complex. But the claim of being democratic in a small sense, right? He was intentionally putting democratic in a small sense against state democracy, and so as opposed to a state democratic thing, he's saying this is a place where the idea of democracy in the sense of interaction and pluralism has always survived, as opposed to the state, which has made attempts at democracy at different times in the 20th century that have seemed to have failed. This is what he was trying to say.
So, actually, this question might be a little off base, I
That's
don't know,
okay.
but earlier on you mentioned that this might have lessons or connections to the current political change, which is maybe arguably not as drastic as enforcement of grid on Rangoon, but would it be right to think that we're entering a new phase of new definitions of Buddhism, now that it's leaving the previous authoritarian style regime into a democratic?
This is a really interesting time to be in Burma. The response to the opening up has been a set of monastic groups. So the legacy of the Thathanabaing position eventually dies off in the colonial, but becomes, by the time you get to the late 20th century, there's a claim that you should have a state Sangha council, and that the state Sangha council will say which monastic factions are legitimate and has the right to arbitrate all of these things, and including down to sort of criminal offenses, has the right to arbitrate basically Vinaya concerns and anything that the state might be interested in, and they are to regulate all. So they have the ability to excommunicate, they have the ability to defrock. This council that's existed under the military is called the Mahasangha Nayaka, so Mahana in Burmese abbreviations. A new group of monks got together wanting to basically say that they had a right to have monastic associations outside of this, and they called themselves Mabatha, which stands for Amu Batha Thathana. Amu is our kind of people. It means kind, but it really means us. It means nation or Burmese-ness. Batha has it has all of the sort of lineages of Bhasha, so from language, but also to religion. So it has both connotations in Sasana. This new monastic idea, Mahabatha, has been the lineage of the nationalist anti-Muslim rhetoric. So there's simultaneously this nationalist rise of Buddhism within here. The kind of preaching they do, I find incredibly boring, because either they have really, really harsh political rhetoric, right, and deeply anti-Muslim rhetoric, and usually against the NLD and the new government, but also their Buddhism is it's kind of just stripped. It's really very simplistic, very, very doctrinal in a sense, sort of like a simple catechism. They're not interested in sort of complex conversations that would have been happening in other movements before this. So on one level, we have these sort of new interpretations of the way they're operating in their Sunday schools, these kind of things, the political anti-Muslim rhetoric. But the one that's got me interested in this is that they're also arguing for new monastic structures. So they're trying to get rid of this top-down other association, Mahasangha Nayaka, and they're challenging its authority at the same time that they're challenging these other sets of discourses. I'm cautious about this lays onto that directly. I think that the ways in which good history works is to make you ask better questions about the present. I don't think I can tell you anything about the present out of it, but I think it's good for poking at what your assumptions are and where those sort of conflicts might be going. Yeah, it's an interesting time to be working in Burma. It's a really cool time to be sitting in Rangoon, looking around, just trying to figure out what's going on.
So I have a question about the Ghana Vimuti. So it seems to me, so I don't know why I'm just curious about why they want to be kind of free from the ritual duties, or is there any monetary, anything concerning like money or any kind of administrative boundaries? So what is actually going on?
Right, what's the conflict? So it's ritual duties, but it's also the ability to arbitrate disputes, right? So that ritual community would be those who would hear Vinaya violations and arbitrate Vinaya violations, but also that local ritual community would have a head of it, and that head would be the one who could, make this basically arbitrate locally. So if you belong to that local gain, then you would have to respect the wishes of that head, and clearly Indra Wintha had no interest in respecting the local heads. But I think you're not wrong that there's probably an economic interest within this. Monks are very good at knowing who their patrons and donors are, and they know that there's competition locally, right? And it is a moment of economic ascendancy for this port town, and clearly, it might be that there's competition between the donors. I don't have any evidence of that, and I don't have the records to say that. I'd suspect that there's probably a conflict over that going as well. Building new monasteries takes some of the religious capital out of that place. So where that money's going to go is always an interesting question. Yeah. Does that make, yeah?
This may be overly simplistic, but when you refer to religious intolerance versus anti-Muslim feelings, are those sort of synonymous, or is one the monastic community and one just the non-monastic community? And how far back does all this anti-Muslim feeling go?
The specific anti-Muslim aspects of it. Okay, so I don't mean to make those different things. So the anti-Muslim sentiment and religious intolerance, I think, are the same thing. I think they're part of the ways in which religion and ethnicity have been constructed from, I would say, the 1920s on. Prior to 1920, when I say this to my Burmese friends, they always get very shocked. But in the early Buddhist associations that are being formed in the colonial cities, it was very common for the Buddhist association not to have its own building. So they might go meet at the Hindu school, and they might go meet at the Muslim high school. That'd actually be a fairly common thing. And the Muslims associations and the Hindu associations and the Chinese associations, like the structures of these, they were sharing things back and forth. That was pretty common in the 1890s and 1910s. The boundaries become increasingly difficult in the 1920s when we get a more rise of a political nationalism amongst the Burmese. And then eventually, the 1930s, we have anti-Indian riots. And these are, there's a concern about, we have economic decline, problems within the rice industry, and we've had a lot of Indian moneylenders. So that's one of the ways in which that's been analyzed. There's also the conflict between rising nationalism and self-rule within India. Burma is actually part of British India until 1935, but the colonial government makes a choice to say, well, if India is getting partial self-rule, Burma is not ready for that yet. And so we get these set of acts in which the India is getting greater and greater autonomy, and Burma is getting less autonomy. Also, massive Indian immigration, and that's two economic stratas, and Chinese immigration the same way. So Indians who are working as clerks, have English language, are getting higher up positions, as well as the very lowest, dirtiest jobs in society are Indians. But Burmese are not seeing themselves; they're not seeing that sort of mobility. So that's part of the conflict in the 30s. Again, a large Chinese business class, but also a large Chinese sort of lowest level of worst. So there's a lot of economic that happen within that. it doesn't turn into really specifically anti-Muslim sentiment, right? This is mostly anti-Indian. Islam becomes an issue somewhere in the mid 20th century, and it's hard to pinpoint. We know that the Wiksa community, which is this, not really even sure, that there are people who engage in longevity or a sorcerer's stone alchemy practices and respect these alchemists, so the alchemists become supernatural figures. And the communities that gather around them are engaged in these supernatural practices for their protection of Buddhism. And they have some pretty clear anti-Muslim rhetoric, that Islam is a threat to Buddhism. And that probably goes back maybe 50s and 60s. Like, that would be one place where it's pretty explicitly anti-Muslim. But this was in no way at the level it is until 5 years ago. 5 years ago is where there's a rise in this. And it's very explicitly, contemporary in that way. So it's not that there's no origins to these things, but the very explicit that there's an idea that Muslims are going to overpopulate Burma, take over, that Islam is a threat, that somehow Islam, that there's going to be some sort of caliphate in Burma, when we're talking about less than 10% of the population is a Muslim population in the country. So that's a kind of, yeah.
Also, what's the level of sort of accountability or responsibility in terms of colonialism as a whole, or is that just way too big a thing to even imagine? And, we can't imagine what colonialism had never happened, but it obviously rearranged the city, it did all these things and threw all these things together. If that had never happened, is it possible to deconstruct and say, well, it would be a happier place, or this would have evolved, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know. The weird and wonderful place that it is the product of the history that's been there, and that said, the 20th century of anti-colonial rhetoric and the decision about so it's very useful to have colonialism to blame your problems on, right? And if it's not the British, the British were handy to blame problems of the military regime that, and if not, then the Americans are always very handy. The neo-colonialist stooges in our mix are always a pretty big threat. And interestingly, now it's becoming the NGOs. Right, NGOs are those people who are coming in and causing troubles, or being blamed. Right, NGOs may or may not be causing trouble, but they're being blamed in the same place that the British at one point had been blamed in the Americans. Which is not to say that the British didn't cause lots of problems. They certainly did, as did American foreign policy, as certainly did NGOs at a certain extent. But it's the rhetoric, it's the place of those things and a rhetoric of that's interesting. Yeah.
So one of the questions a little bit related to Chris's, and that is Tayeb Tau, right? So it's creation of the colonial administration and this attempt to remake the city, but as you presented, it seems to have persisted.
Yeah, it's
that role, and that I find that curious and intriguing. That even when the colonial administration disappears, it's still playing that role in the city. And I wondered, if you could talk a bit more about how it is today, and whether there have been any changes in its role in sort of imagination of Rangoon and what it does. Because it's curious to me that it keeps doing
what it's doing.
What it did, as a result of British interference.
So part of it is I have a really interesting colleague who is doing a PhD in law, and she's looking at property holding because part of, there's massive expansion in the city right now, and so people are interested in how people hold property. But property holding goes back to this time period, right? And in fact, the Muslims who own property in the city have put it in religious trusts. A lot of, and it's actually a mess. Don't try and buy a piece of property in Rangoon right now. It's a mess to find a title on anything. Partly because we've had really persistent. So the monasteries that have been removed, you'll get a Buddhist association will have a small building, a small apartment, a small thing, but there's not really monastic space within that original grid that I showed you. Now, on the edges of it, it's much, much larger. That has those monasteries have expanded and they're established. And so if you get a little bit further out, there's plenty of monastic space. But Diepda is the only one in the tight-in space of this. I'm curious too how it's pulled off what it's done, because at different moments, the first post-colonial democratic government looks to go in and clean house, and they come in and try to clean house. And within a few years, Diepda is back to its sort of old ways. After 88, it's very clear the military government and the Mahana, the Sangha Council, come in, and this is when a lot of the names change of the monasteries. They give them new sort of prettified, really sort of Buddhist-y names. This is the Sasana and the Pariyatti, and this instead of what were the names of old small towns. And then they do this again in the 90s, and then again after 2007. It's clear that there's some construction in there right now. It's clear that some things have been destroyed within the past 5 years, and there's a couple of big monasteries going in. And also, I'm not completely clear about the politics between all of the monks within it. So when you start asking about history, you get a bit, oh yeah, the guy over there will know. I don't really know. But the guy over on the other side is actually tied to sort of important monastic institutions elsewhere, which are tied to the government. So there are clearly conflicts between the different monks within. But even after some of these purges are quite literal purges, like the Tavoy Monastery I'm really interested in. The head monk said, yeah, no, I know there's a history. That's great. No, when I was handed the monastery, they cleaned it out, and I found a couple of things left in the corner, but it was literally, they just purged all of the even the items that had been in the monastery. So there was one picture of the old abbot left, and that was it. But it's something about the way in which people flow in and out of there and through there has maintained over all this time. There's still people with luggage and laundry hanging everywhere. It's kind of, and shockingly, women's laundry too in different places.
That makes me want to put our graduate students on the spot. Oh, sorry. Do you have a question? Ms. Harl? I can't. Yes, please go. Before I do, no.
Could you say something about the place of the Chinese and their Mahayana Buddhism in this picture of Burmese nationalism?
It's something I'm interested more and more about, the ways in which Buddhism is conceived and the ways in which Mahayana, or rather what we think of as Mahayana, is conceived within this, right? There's two clear Buddhist temples just in Chinatown, right? And not far from here. And the actual connections between these, I don't know, but I can track some of the Chinese donors, like Chinese businessmen. I can begin to track that they had some connection to the Mahayana temples, but that they're making major donations to the Burmese institutions. There's a couple of other debates that happen that are really interesting. So the pagoda trustees for the Shwedagon Pagoda, and late 19th century, we get, the rise of lots of construction. So they're building rest houses and prayer halls and everything on the pagoda compound. And the British allow a public election of the pagoda trustees who are in charge of all of this construction and caring for the pagoda. There's a debate over whether Chinese are Buddhist enough to be allowed to vote, right? Is a Chinese Buddhist enough to vote for a pagoda trustee? Which is a really fascinating question. And as far as I can tell, the ultimate decision is no, they're not Buddhist enough to vote. But they are Buddhist enough to have their own associations with their own rest houses, and they can donate and create these big rest houses and actually have a fairly clear presence on the pagoda platform. But somehow citizenship, identity, sort of voting issues got pushed to the side. Then the next set of issues that I really want to dive into, I came home this last time with stacks of law books, because there's all sorts of court cases about inheritance, about colonial law, because there's a production of a thing called Burmese Buddhist law. Right, because family law is all divided by religious, right? So you're either under Hindu law, or you're under Muslim law, or you're under Burmese Buddhist law. And then the question is, where does Chinese law fall within this? So there's a production of an idea that there's Chinese law, and then what do they mean by Chinese law for overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia of this time? And then there's all sorts of conflicts. So can a Chinese Buddhist adopt a Burmese Buddhist? Or can a Chinese Buddhist donate? At what level of practice does it take to prove that you would exist under Burmese law. And the reason this is well documented is because it's all inheritance, right? It's all about moving money and property. So it matters, actually, your religious affiliation matters almost not at all during your lifetime. But at death, if you had any money, your family's going to dispute because inheritance is completely different in each of these legal systems. So a different group of people is going to want to argue you belong to these different categories. And in those fights, you can begin to see how complicated a definition of who is a Buddhist, who is a Chinese Buddhist is a vague category in these texts, who is a Burmese Buddhist, and how the law might work on it. So that's one of the things I actually want to work on now. There's an interesting really case about somebody who's deemed to be a Hindu. He's born from a family that would be thought to be Hindu, but he actually is probably one of the biggest donors and foundational people to the Burmese Buddhist movements of the late 19th, early 20th century, right? He's a huge Mahabodhi supporter. He works with Dharmapala. Like, he's clearly, in any other narrative, would be a Buddhist, but he's deemed a Hindu on his death for inheritance. So, yeah, that's the kind of stuff I'm trying to figure out more of.
Do you have a question, Michaela, about that?
I was wondering about the lay people. You mentioned that there are lay people living in this monastery. How is the division in terms of space, and how are there like different rules they play there?
I haven't been bold enough to just walk in. And, the first monk from Tavoy that I was talking to was not in these monasteries, but was over at another monastery. And I said, there's about 40 different Tavoy affiliated monasteries in Rangoon, and I had to figure out which one to go to. And so the first question I asked him is like, why are there so many Tavoy monasteries? And he said, to house people from Tavoy. And in Burmese, you can't say people means lay people. And as I look over, like, there's two guys, clearly their mats are on the floor, clearly there's things hung up, there's people living right there. And yeah, it's clear, like, I saw there are women even living in upstairs portions of some of the older monasteries. Like, it's not completely, you can begin to see why the sort of elites are really nervous about this place, because it looks like it's violating what we think should be the right rules. But it depended on, in the contemporary moment, I can't tell you historically, it depends on which monastery. Some of them were clearly didn't have any women's clothing around. Some of them clearly had no lay people's clothing at all. Others clearly had, and one or two lay donors living there, handling sort of monastery affairs as normal, but a larger group of people living and actually, operating out of there is not acceptable to these folks. But I haven't sort of pushed my way in. I have a feeling that this is a place where they would be really resistant to me asking too many questions about who's sleeping where and why. So I try, but.
but is your argument that mixture is a product of colonialism, that's a modern phenomenon?
No. In small monasteries, like the rest house would be a place where, small village monasteries, that's not that uncommon to maybe have one or two people who'd lived there a longer time. Or the rest house, like if you had a group of pilgrims coming through, you'd always stay at the rest house. That was normal, like to stay within the monastic complex. But this many people coming in an urban area and staying for extended periods, it's definitely a product of the fact that people are coming to the colonial center, right? They need to come there for education or for economics or something else. Like the fact that this place has done that so much. The idea that it happens every so often or happens a little bit in a monastery elsewhere in villages or small towns, that's not unheard of. It's not like this is some completely unorthodox thing. Again, I know because when they tried to clean it up, it was clear that they weren't just cleaning up Theato. Theato was the first place they tried to, in the 1950s, they tried to like sweep in and teach the monks that lay people are not allowed to live with monks. And this is the first place they go. This is clear, but it's also clear that they have programs to do it around the rest of the country, that this is happening a little bit other places. So it happens in both, but so much in this place has to do with where it exists on economic and other lines of movement. Like that people come from the hinterlands to the capital for all sorts of advancement and education and economic trade. There's lots of reasons to move in and out.
Is there children's laundry as well?
That's a good question. I'm walking through. I can't, you know what, you're right. No, I haven't seen any, which is interesting because there'd usually be like temple boys, right? But actually I don't. Do temple boys do their laundry? Maybe that's the problem. Because I can't think of
Anyway. What I wanted to put you guys on the spot about was just a little bit about these questions of space. So they did this graduate conference on issues of space. So I was wondering what was resonating with what we were thinking about for that, and then with Dr. Turner's project, maybe you guys have some questions coming out of those conversations.
I was interested actually in this issue of cosmopolitanism, and then how does this get represented in space? And cosmopolitanism, it's a very wonderful category, but it's also, it's almost a monolithic
it doesn't
category, and it obscures the fact that there's differences. So I was wondering if, kind of walking through the space, do you see buildings that like assert ethnic difference or identity in any ways?
Only to the extent that the surviving names are names of places, those would sort of potentially be asserting that in the contemporary moment. I'm actually not seeing asserting ethnic difference inside this space at this point. And I think maybe if I started to push people, although often if you push people for ethnicity, it's a very fluid category, right? The real word for this is amu, like what kind of person are you is literally the question. I have a good friend who used to work for the International Committee of the Red Cross interviewing people in prisons, and she knew that the person was a Karen Baptist. But the Red Cross needed an ethnicity box, right? And so she had to say, what kind of person are you? And he says, well, I'm a Baptist. And what kind of Baptist are you? Well, I'm a God-fearing Baptist. And she kept pushing him because it was ethnicity wasn't in his head. Like that wasn't the way he would have asserted himself. Although often for Christians and Muslims, ethnicity and religion could be interchangeable, right? You exist to this category that is outside. I think for cosmopolitanism, you're right, and I think one of the reasons I'm cautious about this is that it often also obscures the fact that there's a different kinds of interactions when it comes to in terms of class, right? And as far as I can tell, the kind of ethnic interactions that are happening in this space are much more plebeian, as I would say. These are folks who are petty traders or villagers who are coming through. This is not folks who've made lots and lots of money. The monasteries themselves are actually quite nice. For the period in which they were built, there was money put into them. I think I could date most of them right to around between 1910 and 1920 is when the money goes into building these things. But I think it's coming from this lots of small donations from lots of petty traders coming through. I don't see big donors, at least not the way I see them in the Tavoy Monastery or things like that. So that, I think you're right to be cautious about this category of cosmopolitanism because it often is a way of saying, these are nice people we like, as opposed to saying this is the kind of interaction specifically that's happening there.
I had a question about the gender culture that you might have seen, since there's a mixing of different religions there. So many questions in there. Did you see birth control in the chemist? Did you see, if there's no children's laundry,
well, it's right across the street from the,
And if there's Muslim women, do they wear veils? How do you see?
How do I see these performed?
Inequality?
I've seen Muslim women walking through. I don't think I've seen anyone wearing a veil living in the monastic. I don't think that's probably a level in the contemporary moment that would be way too much. It is interesting to me too, though. Practices of veiling have changed over the past maybe decade, and that lots of Muslim women in Burma wouldn't have worn a headscarf and are now wearing a headscarf. And I don't know what all the politics of that are, but I think it may be to feel that it's a community under threat. The larger gendered issues, one of the big complaints of the early 20th century is that these festivals that were happening inside that the elites really didn't like, that they were having too much fun, that it was too joyous and too exciting, and that there were young ladies, that there were too many young women coming to these events inside this complex, and that the implication was that the monks were distracted. So it's clearly a gendered problem within it, and the number of women that are staying there now. So in the 1950s, we had this statement that 2,000 families are living there, which would imply children. But he doesn't lay out exactly. He doesn't give me where they were living or anything more than that. Just simply that there were 2,000 families living there. There are clearly women staying there now. My impression is they were younger women. They were unmarried. They were without kids. That was more, folks trying to come to the city and get a start in life. And this is where they arrived. But the other issue is this is right across from the Rangoon General Hospital and has been for the whole period. And it still is the most important hospital. And so there's lots of people who are now staying there while a family are having treatment at the hospital, and going in and out. And so there's lots more women going back and forth. So women might, if their family members being treated at the hospital, the women would be the ones who'd be taking care of the family members there. So that's a lot more women traipsing through the area and maybe staying or maybe not staying.
Was there much of a tradition for nuns in Burma?
Yeah. There's a really long tradition. We have pretty good history on the lay nuns, not bhikkhunis. There's a debate over whether there were ever bhikkhunis in Burma, and if you're interested in that time period, you can look into it. But the lay nun movement that's pretty strong and we have a history of goes to the 1850s. And in fact, there are lay nuns who were teachers to the king and royally sanctioned, and lived in a monastic enclave outside of the royal capitals. And there's been a resurgence of them. There's actually a much greater respect, and now there's a tradition, or new tradition since the 90s, of little girls being ordained as novice nuns. And also it's becoming more and more clear that the nuns are very serious scholastically, like they're actually treated with a lot of respect for that to a certain extent. Now, they don't get the same donations as the monks. They don't get treated the same way as the monks because they're lay nuns. They're not bhikkhunis. And so the hierarchies are clear there. But yeah, it's certainly on the rise in that way.
All right, well, please join me in thanking Dr. Turner again. And thank you all.